When we talk about World War II, we tend to focus on the famous generals, the groundbreaking machinery, and the grand strategies. We look at the movements of troops and the turning points decided by human hands. But in doing so, we often ignore the most ruthless, heavily armed, and unpredictable third party in the entire conflict: Mother Nature. Nature didn't care if you were fighting for the Axis or the Allies. It didn't care about meticulously planned supply lines, and it certainly didn't care about your radar. In this video, we are looking at 4 times that extreme natural disasters directly altered the course of World War II. We will see how a sudden volcanic eruption managed to destroy an entire bomber fleet. We'll uncover how a freak freeze broke an unstoppable army, and how a devastating cyclone sparked a massive geopolitical catastrophe. Finally, we will look at a terrifying super typhoon that dealt a harder blow to the US Navy than the Japanese fleet did. Let's look at what happens when the deadliest war in human history collides with the deadliest forces of the natural world. In December of 1944, the United States Third Fleet, officially operating as Task Force 38, was widely considered to be the most powerful naval armada on the planet. Commanded by the famous and incredibly aggressive Admiral William Bull Halsey, this massive floating fortress of a fleet was conducting operations deep in the Philippine Sea. However, this seemingly unstoppable force had a critical, immediate vulnerability. The fleet was dangerously low on fuel and needed to execute a massive resupply at sea. It is important to remember that weather forecasting in 1944 was not the exact science it is today. It relied almost entirely on scattered barometric readings rather than sophisticated radar or satellites. Admiral Halsey found himself looking at a series of conflicting weather reports. Attempting to navigate the logistical nightmare of refueling dozens of ships, he inadvertently ordered his armada to sail directly into the path of a rapidly forming, compact, but incredibly violent super typhoon. Before the fleet could correct this fatal mistake, they were caught in the belly of the beast. The armada was suddenly trapped in screaming 160-mile-per-hour winds, accompanied by terrifying rogue waves reaching up to 70 feet high. Try to paint a vivid picture of this chaos in your mind. Massive aircraft carriers were pitching and rolling so violently in the immense swells that the heavy cables holding their aircraft began to snap. Heavily strapped-down fighter planes tore loose from the flight decks. These multi-ton machines careened across the ship, crashing into one another and sparking raging fires before being blown directly into the churning ocean below. While the heavy carriers fought the wind and fires, the smaller destroyers were fighting for their absolute survival. Because they were so critically low on fuel, these ships were sitting dangerously high in the water, making them remarkably top-heavy and fatally vulnerable to the towering waves. Battered relentlessly, 3 U.S. destroyers, the USS Spence, the USS Hull, and the USS Monaghan, were pushed past their breaking points. All 3 ships capsized and sank completely beneath the waves. When the skies finally cleared, the sheer toll of the storm was staggering. Over 140 aircraft were completely destroyed, and 790 American sailors lost their lives in a matter of hours. It highlights a crazy historical irony. Nature had just inflicted more devastating damage on the U.S. Navy in one single afternoon than the Japanese military had managed to achieve in most major engagements that entire year. This catastrophe led directly to a massive naval court of inquiry, and it forced the United States to completely rethink its relationship with extreme weather, directly prompting the creation of the Joint Typhoon Warning Center. By March of 1944, the Allied forces were locked in a grueling campaign, actively pushing their way into Italy. During this intense push, the 340th Bombardment Group of the 12th United States Air Force needed a strategic location to set up their base of operations. They ultimately chose to station themselves at the Pompeii airfield. Yes, that Pompeii. In an incredible display of wartime hubris, the military established their massive bomber base literally in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius. To be fair, the volcano had not experienced a major, catastrophic eruption in decades, lulling the commanders into a false sense of security. But the local Italian civilians, who had lived alongside the volatile mountain for generations, knew better. They warned the stationed troops that the mountain was rumbling and showing distinct signs of waking up. However, the military command had a war to fight, and prioritizing operational logistics over geological threats, they completely ignored the warnings. That decision proved disastrous on March 18th, when Mount Vesuvius violently blew its top. The sudden eruption was earth-shattering, shooting thick, suffocating ash miles into the sky. The mountain began raining down a terrifying torrent of hot pumice, brimstone, and liquid fire right onto the airfield below. While the soldiers and ground crews were able to run and scramble for their lives, their massive fleet of aircraft could not. The visceral damage inflicted on the stationary bombers was unprecedented. Searing hot volcanic ash settled heavily over the aircraft, reaching temperatures so extreme that it literally melted the plane's clear plexiglass turrets. Glowing rocks raining from the sky burned right through the fragile fabric control surfaces of the wings and tails. As the thick ash continued to fall, it built up across the fuselages. This volcanic material is remarkably dense, and as it got heavier and heavier, the sheer weight of it physically snapped the wings right off the B-25 Mitchell bombers. When the eruption finally ceased and the skies cleared, the devastation was absolute. Between 75 and 88 American bombers had been completely destroyed by the mountain. It is a moment of pure historical irony that perfectly drives home our main point. The German Luftwaffe operating in the region had been trying desperately to cripple this exact bomber fleet, but they had completely failed to stop the American advance. Mount Vesuvius managed to achieve what the German Air Force could not, and it did it in a single weekend. The volcano wiped out an estimated $25 million worth of advanced aircraft in 1944 money, and it achieved this massive destruction without firing a single bullet. In the winter of 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive military undertaking that remains the largest land invasion in human history. The formidable German war machine was systematically slicing its way through the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, and a decisive victory seemed entirely imminent to everyone watching. The German forces advanced so far and so fast that vanguard units could practically see the towering spires of the Kremlin in Moscow. However, this unprecedented military success bred a dangerous and ultimately fatal level of arrogance. The German high command was so supremely confident that they would completely win the campaign before the autumn leaves even fell that they literally did not pack winter gear for their advancing army. There were no heavy coats issued to the infantry, no winter-grade oil provided for the armored vehicles, and absolutely no antifreeze supplied for the engines. Everyone knows that winter in Russia is always bad, but the winter of 1941 was something else entirely. It was not just a cold season, it was a historically severe meteorological anomaly. As the German forces dug in outside the Soviet capital, temperatures across the Eastern Front rapidly plummeted to a staggering -40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is also -40 degrees Celsius. This represents a level of brutal, biting cold that fundamentally alters how machinery operates and how the human body functions, dropping far below anything the invading army had ever anticipated or prepared for. At these mind-numbing temperatures, we get to see exactly how a highly advanced mechanized army dies in the cold. The mighty blitzkrieg, the lightning war doctrine that had swiftly conquered most of Western Europe, ground to a complete and literal halt. The standard oil used inside the engines of the vaunted German panzer tanks froze completely solid, rendering the terrifying armored divisions entirely useless. The specialized gun grease applied to infantry weapons hardened in the freezing air, causing vital machine guns and standard-issue rifles to instantly jam when desperate soldiers tried to fire them. Even the crucial supply chains were completely shattered, as logistics trains couldn't move toward the front lines because the water inside their steam boilers simply froze. The human toll of this catastrophic logistical oversight was absolutely horrifying. German troops were left stranded in the middle of freezing, relentless blizzards, wearing nothing but their thin, lightweight summer uniforms. In a desperate bid to survive the plunging temperatures, soldiers resorted to stuffing crumbled newspaper into their uninsulated boots just to retain a tiny fraction of their body heat. It wasn't nearly enough to hold off the elements. Frostbite rapidly reached epidemic levels across the sprawling German camps, leading to horrifying mass amputations in primitive field hospitals. Tragically, thousands upon thousands of soldiers ended up freezing to death in their sleep, quietly claimed by the relentless weather. By physically freezing the German war machine in its tracks, nature effectively hit the pause button on the entire Axis advance. This monumental meteorological delay gave the Soviet Union the one thing they desperately needed to survive: time. Because the German forces were completely immobilized and dying in the cold, the Soviets had enough time to rush in specialized, winter-equipped Siberian reserve troops. These highly adapted soldiers launched a massive, devastating counterattack, successfully pushing the freezing German forces back from the gates of Moscow. This pivotal moment transformed the Eastern Front from a rapid, glorious conquest into a grinding, multi-year nightmare that ultimately cost Germany the entire war. In this theater of combat, nature didn't just participate in the battle, it actively stepped in and decided the winner. In October of 1942, while much of the world's attention was firmly fixed on the raging battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, the British territory of India served as a massive staging ground and a vital supply hub for the Allied war effort. But this critical region was about to face a devastating threat that didn't come from an enemy army. A massive tropical cyclone suddenly slammed into the vulnerable coast of Bengal. The ferocious wind tore through the area, but the true killer was the terrifying storm surge. A massive wall of seawater swept aggressively inland, violently swallowing everything in its path. The immediate toll of the cyclone was absolutely staggering. Around 40,000 people were killed almost instantly by the crushing waters and collapsing infrastructure. But as the water finally began to recede, it left behind something even worse for the survivors. It had completely destroyed the region's crucial agricultural land. The massive saltwater deluge drowned the highly anticipated upcoming rice harvest and effectively killed off the local livestock that the population desperately depended on. Under normal peacetime circumstances, outside relief would quickly come to a region struck by such a massive natural disaster. But this was an active war zone, and the cyclone violently collided with the grim logistical realities of World War II to create a horrific domino effect. The Japanese military had recently occupied neighboring Burma, an action that completely cut off Bengal's primary source of imported rice. Making matters significantly worse, the British authorities had enacted a harsh, scorched earth policy in the area. Driven by the intense fear that the Japanese might invade and capture local resources, the British had purposefully seized local boats and strictly restricted the movement of food supplies. This brutal combination of wartime logistics and paranoia turned the cyclone into the fatal match that lit a devastating powder keg. Without any local crops to harvest, without crucial food imports from Burma, and with restricted transport severely limiting any internal relief efforts, the region rapidly plunged into the horrific Bengal famine of 1943. The sheer scale of this resulting tragedy is almost difficult to comprehend. It is estimated that between 1.5 to 3 million people ultimately died. It stands as a dark, chilling reminder of how a natural disaster, when inextricably mixed with the paranoia and logistical blockades of a global war, can painfully escalate into one of the greatest civilian tragedies of the entire 20th century. World War II was a masterclass in human engineering and strategy, but these four events prove that military might means absolutely nothing when the planet itself decides to step in. Mother Nature is undefeated. Which of these historical disasters surprised you the most? Is there one you want me to do a full 15-minute deep dive video on? Let me know down in the comments. If you enjoyed this look at the wilder side of history, hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed and click the bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.